Welcome again to the Push-Pull Podcast. I'm Varun Rajan, and we interview professionals about their career transitions and specifically the push and pull factors that informed those transitions. In today's episode, I speak to Robbins, somebody that I went to high school with and haven't reconnected with in several years. Marshall has a fascinating story. He started off doing construction on job sites, moved into finance, then had a stellar career in tech sales before coming back to financing construction projects in his current role at Herzer Financial. We had a really candid conversation about a couple of different things. The power of great mentors is something that comes up over and over again. The importance of people, network, and relationships in finding work that is impactful and is fulfilling. We also get into a really candid conversation about burnout, the factors that go into burnout, and also the impact of macroeconomic factors on the expectations placed on people in sales roles. So absolutely super interesting. You might hear a couple of different things if you're not super familiar with sales roles, SDR, BDR, that's sales development representative or business development representative. Marshall explains that a little bit. You might hear SMB thrown around, which is small to medium-sized businesses. And so just a little note to make sure everyone's on the same page. If you can, obviously, please share this podcast with anybody that you can, wherever you listen, or if you're watching this on YouTube, give me a like and subscribe, a comment. If you have any questions or even have anything that you would have liked me to dig into a little bit more, you can always shoot me an email at Varun, that's VARUN, at pushpullpodcast.com. So without any further ado, here's Marshall. All right, I'm here with Marshall Robbins. Thanks for joining us, Marshall.
Of course.
Give us a 30 to 60 second overview of who you are and what you care about today.
I would say that I've been fortunate enough to wear a bunch of different hats. And right now, my focus is really on delivering high quality capital to folks that are looking to do construction, really any kind of real estate transactions in the state of California. And it's been a windy road to get to where I am today, but every single one of those stepping stones has been invaluable. And just feel super fortunate to be chatting with someone like yourself.
If I were to ask you like where your career started out or how you would want to inform the beginning of your career, how far back would you go?
I would say, generally speaking, getting out of school, high school especially, and I know you and I went to the same high school, so we have a shared experience there. I think in 2008, it was this unknown, right? We're in a relatively deep recession.
Right.
I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have the drive to push towards any direction and kind of figure it out. I was a little too preoccupied with figuring out what step 30 was instead of what step 1 was.
Tell me a little bit about what that means, like step 1 versus step 30. Did you have a sense of like a vision for yourself? Where were you when you graduated high school? What was in front of you and what were the things going through your head at the time?
Yeah, I'll be transparent with you, Varun. I was pretending to go to community college. I enrolled, but didn't go to class. I was a little too preoccupied with surfing and having fun with friends and just doing what I wanted to. And part of that was because this kind of comes back to that step 1 versus step 30 thing. Step 1 doesn't feel particularly interesting if you don't know what it's leading to. And especially if you're a young person that you don't have that foresight. And I certainly did not. And for me, step 1 would have been attending that class and then step 2 or 3 is then normal career progression that I think a lot of folks that are, I'll just say white collar professionals are accustomed to, right? That
knowledge work.
Typical progression through school into career and beyond. And it was very hard for me to take this kind of abstract idea of a job that may or may not exist in the future for me because I took step 1 or step 2 or step 3. All right. So I think that was the most difficult part at the time in terms of the kind of being lost piece.
Yeah. And let me see if I'm understanding this correctly. Step 30 is this kind of ambiguous, you are successful as a knowledge worker in some kind of like ambiguous corporate environment. And
Yes.
you're, okay, that sounds great. That would be nice to like get there, but what does that actually look like? Why would I care about that? And then every part of the path to getting to this ambiguous place is it's just not that tight. I'm not excited about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a lot of, I was immature too. I mean, it's a confluence of a lot of different things. It's where I was, again, not understanding where that path was going to lead. And also just not generally being interested in learning and taking that next step. And so I ended up in construction. I ended up working for a general contractor for a little while. And that was great. It gave me a lot of focus. I think it shone a light on just the workforce in general, just zooming even further out, getting to work on a Monday morning, right? Doing the things that you need to do to both get through the workday, accomplish, be productive, right? Do all the things that you need to do to get a paycheck and to pay the bills, all that good stuff. And it also provides a sense of identity too. I think that was really important.
Were you still taking classes at community college, or did you wrap up, like you said, pretending to go to community college in order to start working? What was the decision point there where you were like, I'm not really feeling school? Or maybe that wasn't the explicit decision, but you talked a little bit about what you got out of that experience, but I'm really curious about like why you made that decision to go into construction in the first place.
It was two things. One, it was, I did at one point just have to be like, hey, look, why am I paying $12 at the time? I know that's changed dramatically in the last 15 years, but at the time, $12 a year to go to classes, to enroll in classes, I should say, that I'm not going to go to. Knew in my heart I was never going to take seriously. And then how and why into construction? Truthfully, it was convenient. It was work that was available, and I had the opportunity to learn something from somebody else who knew more than I did about something. And that just happened to be construction in that instance. It was actually a good buddy of mine. His mother was in a partnership with somebody who was a general contractor. And so that's how it happened. And so I put what I had into that when he could give me hours, and it returned dividends. It was tremendously important for me in my kind of personal development to have that job and take it seriously and want to do right by that person who at the time was a bit of a mentor.
Yeah, that's really great. You had this social draw to make sure that you were like showing up as your best self as well.
1,000%. Yeah. 1,000%. And the other thing too, my social group, right? They were all in school and doing things, right? And in the idle time when I was both not going to school and not working construction, there was a bit of a gap there. That didn't feel great for a variety of reasons. So first bang, you look around and everybody seems to be doing the right thing. And for myself, I just was, like, oh, what am I doing? What am I going to do with this? And so the construction piece came in at the perfect time for me.
That's really interesting. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, later on too, but it's like there's the people are doing the right thing versus like people are doing something in particular. And maybe you realize that school, after a while of trying it, seeing that other people are doing it too, you realize like that's not the thing for you at this point in time. But there's still something that you want to be pursuing and like putting your productive energy towards.
And I think I want to be careful in making sure that I'm not like creating this distinction that going to college right away is the right thing. I think what I was more concerned with is the right thing in that instance was something, just not being idle and doing nothing. I think that was kind of the important piece, right? Where it was those few months where I really wasn't doing a whole lot other than surfing and, like I said, having fun with my friends. Obviously not super productive. I learned a lot from that. Obviously those were valuable experiences and I still think about them fondly, but and for me in that moment, the right thing was to do something and pursue something that, would at least give me a little bit of money in my pocket, one, and two, again, give me that sense of identity, sense of belonging in society more broadly. There's this kind of a nebulous feeling like, am I participating in the world?
Yeah.
And I didn't feel like I was.
Yeah, totally. No, that's super important. When did you end up wrapping up your time in construction? What kind of led to that and what came next?
As a young person, I can't express this enough. I was so grateful to have that opportunity. I would say that I looked around at these job sites and there were older men, maybe in their like late 40s and early 50s, who weren't moving around as well as maybe somebody who was in their late 40s or early 50s maybe should. So their bodies were just worn out. The other piece of this too is, I wasn't logging hours towards a general contractor's license either. It was just the nature of the way the employment worked. And so it wasn't really something that I was thinking about long term. And inversely, I wasn't thinking about the kinds of challenges or solving the types of problems that I wanted to. I was still curious. I was reading like the Financial Times and doing all kinds of other things outside of it, kind of took care of my curiosity outside of the construction role. So I figured, all right, seems like a good time to go ahead and buckle down and I should say, commit myself to pursuing this a little more seriously. And so I started taking night classes at community college, and then eventually I ended up at school full time.
What was the kind of like timeline between you dropping community college classes like that you knew you weren't taking very seriously before to like when you started enrolling in some community college classes again part-time while you were working?
Yeah, it was a few years. It was a
Yeah.
few years. I want to say 2.5, 3 years. My time in construction wasn't long. I don't want to get on here and pretend like I was swinging a hammer for 15 years. That's not true.
Sure.
I swung a hammer for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, but that at that time in your life, like 2 or 3 years is like 10 to 12% of
Right,
your conscious life, right? It's a reasonable amount of time. And I'm really curious about like where in that curve of, oh, okay, I can actually see the value in like going to school. I've found this area of interest. Like what was different 2 to 3 years later?
I'd grown up a little bit. I think that there's definitely, I'm sure there's just like a literal physiological change, right? And brain chemistry and all that good stuff. So I think that played a part in it. Also, social pressures, right? A lot of folks like yourself and a lot of my really tight-knit social circle, they were getting through school. They were in their senior year of college, and I had 0 units to my name, zero collegiate credits to my name. So it was one of those things where it's like, gosh, not only do I want to start thinking about different problems and wrestling with different challenges, I do want to make sure that I'm positioned to participate in kind of that knowledge-based workforce later on at a time when it's not going to be a huge disadvantage to me graduating from college, theoretically, when I'm 40. That doesn't seem like a good option to me.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and get this ball rolling and engage with that process with a little more attention.
If I'm thinking about you moving from construction into going back to school, it's like push factors are, I don't know if I want to be doing this for the rest of my life. I see the impacts that it's having on my colleagues. And then there is a combination of pressures around you. You're seeing other people like go into maybe be about to go into a knowledge-based workforce and be successful. That's probably something that you're a little bit more interested in doing longer term. That kind of like the appeal, the allure, and also like the pathway towards that step 30 is starting to become a little bit more clear as you're seeing your peers move in that direction, and you're organically getting more interest in stuff. You said you were like picking up the Financial Times and stuff like that, and part of it is also growing up a little bit. Is that fair to say? Those are
that's totally fair to say. Yeah, and looking back, trying to clock the way that I was feeling, kind of 15 years after the fact, that's the way I feel now. If you had asked me the same question, what were the things that were pushing you at the time? I may have given you a different answer. I'm not sure.
I think that's fair. That's the whole point of this, honestly, Marshall, is to be like, hey, if we were to look back and try to put ourselves in our shoes from 10, 15 years ago or whatever point, how would we think about what our motivations were at the time, put a name to those things and be explicit about them? And anyway, you tell us about school. Where did you go? What did you study?
Oh, yeah.
What did you like about it?
I went to community college at Cabrillo College here in Santa Cruz. Go Seahawks. And eventually transferred to Humboldt State, which I think is now Cal Poly Humboldt, which was fantastic. And it was that decision-making process in terms of just selecting that school. They had a business administration and finance program. That was first checkbox for me. And they had a matriculation agreement with the California Community College system. I just signed that agreement, fulfilled my obligations, and then chose Humboldt State as my landing place.
Tell us about your time there. What did you like about it? What did you not like about it? Was there anything in particular that maybe gave you an extra sense of clarity on what you wanted to do next?
Yeah. Gosh, I got really lucky. So just hitting on the thing that went really well there. So what were the things that were absolute pros? I got lucky and had a fantastic finance professor. He's a guy named Kian Kwok Pham, who he was at one point the CFO of Atari back in their heyday.
Oh, wow.
And a company called US Leasing, which is one of those companies that nobody's ever heard of, but they do an insane number top line every year. Lots of large capitally intensive projects that they're involved in and things like that. So he had done some adjunct professor teaching, I guess, at like UC Berkeley, Haas. He had moved up there because his wife was in poor health. The way he told the story is the doctor recommended that she go to a place with cleaner air. And so Humboldt State was lucky enough to have him as somebody that was on staff and teaching for 5 or 6 years, I think. And I was lucky enough to catch him for 2 of those. And I think he did a really good job of keeping his expectations as us pretty high. And he used a lot of course material from NYU Stern School of Business. There's a gentleman there named Aswaf Damodaran who runs the corporate finance side of the finance program. I think he chairs the finance program too, but I could be wrong there. So anyway, I think that was just from a mentorship perspective, an instruction perspective, and like an expectations perspective, felt like it kicked me up a notch in kind of both my expectations of my education and then my expectations of myself once I left that institution. What are you capable of doing? What are you capable of applying for and learning how to do, right? Because nobody leaves school with the exact skills they need to do the job that they're going to get out of school. They just have the skills and confidence in themselves that they'll be able to figure it out and present themselves well enough to get that first job.
Yeah. And do you think that's what you left with as a result of this experience?
1,000%. Yeah. That was, if you had looked at 2010 construction marshal and said, hey, 3.5, 4 years, you're going to be in Boston at a private equity firm running a due diligence process for an acquisition, I would have said, what? I don't understand. I don't even know what half that means. This comes back to whatever that next step was. And I think that Kwok Pham, my professor, just encouraged us to take those steps really seriously. That next part of your journey, whatever it is, just take it seriously, do it with intention, and make sure that you're giving yourself the best opportunity for whatever maybe the steps right after those are. And so I felt tremendously grateful for him, and I've tried to stay in touch, but I think he's fallen off the map a little bit. I haven't been able to get in touch with him, which is a shame because I'd really like to thank him for. So if he ever sees this or if he ever listens to this, Kim, you're the man. I really appreciate everything you do for everybody.
That's sweet. One of the things I'm curious about, you said you overlapped with him for a couple of years. Did you have one class with him? You said you kept him on as a mentor. What was that relationship like?
Yeah. I think I want to say 80% of my finance courses through him because the finance program at Humboldt State was very corporate finance focused. Mm-hmm. So a majority of my classes were basically either accounting, or finance. Mm-hmm. I think I took maybe 1 or 2 like marketing classes or something like that. But a majority of the classes I was taking were the finance classes. And that included corporate finance. And I think there was a series of those. I want to say 3 of them. Okay. If I'm not mistaken. And then there was an international finance course that was really interesting. And that was more on kind of the currency markets and arbitrage and all that good stuff. And then there was the investment finance, which is how you do Black-Scholes, all these equations that kind of dictate pricing options and the equities markets, really. That was its main focus. And yeah, a vast majority of the time that I spent there was with him in one way or another. And he was omnipresent because in order to pass the class, you had to actively participate. Okay. And work with him. He designed the class in such a way where you really were forced to go to his office and ask him things one-on-one. It would have been impossible to do if you did go to his office and ask him thoughtful questions about what you were trying to accomplish out of the classroom. Yeah. And so that was really helpful. It was tough. That finance program, I think that first corporate finance class, which was your introduction to this professor, was rough going. I think every single assignment and exam was on a curve. And I think of the 35 that started, I think 7 of us ended up walking out with the
Dang. Wow.
And you really had to want to like work with him specifically.
So you have this incredible kind of what sounds like a formalizing experience. You're interested in really pursuing a career in knowledge work. You have this interest in finance. You go to Humboldt State. You find this professor that's truly inspiring and gets you to really up level in your expectations of yourself. Awesome. What comes next for you?
Yeah, it was figure out how to execute on those expectations. Anyway, I knew I wanted an internship at the very least that summer. And so I started calling around to everywhere that had private equity, investment banking, debt markets, equity market, anything. And I finally, basically, for those who are in tech and who are listening to this now, I basically SDR'd my way into this private equity opportunity out in Boston,
Nice.
a search fund, which is a unique private equity model. But I got in there and I was lucky enough to have another good mentor, a woman named Leah Majid, who actually just did her acquisition not more than a year and a half, 2 years ago. The one that we all worked on. And I mean, I was a lot of deal sourcing. So that summer I spent a lot of time trying to, basically vet organizations. Does this meet our investment criteria, right? Type of stuff. Then once we found something, then it became a question of, okay, now let's go through the diligence process, right? So now we have an LOI in place and now we've got to go and engage everybody. How do we figure out how to structure this deal, right? Do we have a data room, right? Do we have the debt vehicles that we need to leverage this in a way that makes sense for us to exit later, right? All that kind of stuff. And so it kept me on for a little while longer. And so I came back to the West Coast and worked remote.
So the summer wound down, but there was still some work, and like your lease on your apartment or whatever was probably up, and then you were like,
oh,
"All right,
yeah. Okay. I flew home. Yeah. Once I was done with Boston, I was just working so much. And no offense to the good people of Boston. I know it's a great city. I think I was working so much and I had a long distance girlfriend. So I wasn't spending a ton of time trying to be social and build my network there. Really, I was just hyper focused on that role. And I was 60, 70 hour weeks and a lot of just a very singular focus there. And so by the time it was over and my short-term lease in Boston was up, I was ready to go home.
What came next for you? Your internship wrapped up. Were you hopeful for some kind of like full-time opportunity from these guys? Was that on the table at all?
No, but I knew I needed something on my resume that said, hey, this kid isn't just fresh out of college with zero experience. And so it was kind of like,
cool.
I think in my mind, I was like, okay, I just graduated with this finance degree. I would like to be in something like investment banking or private equity or whatever, right? But I knew that I'd be competing with graduates of some of the best schools in the country. And I knew that if I was ever going to stand a chance, I was going to have to back it up a little bit. And to me, that was just at least having that private equity experience on there. I came back to the West Coast, like I mentioned, moved in with my folks for a few months and started applying to anything and everything that was finance related. So FP&A, like I mentioned, the IB stuff, VC stuff, PE, pretty much anything that I could use my skills in from like a modeling perspective, really. I was like, okay, we're going to go gung ho into this. And I had a spreadsheet, as a finance person would, of every single application that I had a little Gantt chart, all that good stuff. And
you had a Gantt chart for your job search?
Sure did. Yeah.
Awesome.
And for a long time, I did not get past that first cell. I can tell you, it was, I think I applied to 216 or something. It was in the 200s. It was a lot of applications. And I got a call back from a big old goose egg. Just none. No callbacks or anything in that world. And
you've gotten this internship experience. You are hungry, you're ambitious, you have a space that you're targeting and some like credibility that you've built up. And you are seeing like no response from the market.
I mean, it was super disheartening, flat out. It was brutal. At a certain point, it's like, I have to move forward. I have to do something. This obviously isn't working and it doesn't seem like it's going to work. It was just, I also didn't have a tremendous number of connections in the industry either, which I think is huge. I think a lot of my best jobs I've ever had, right, came from relationships with previous folks. And I think I just didn't have any. And so I was just coming in and trying to basically cold call people with applications and resume. Yep. You're just not going to get picked up that way. And I knew it at the time too, but I wanted so desperately to be in that world. It just didn't work out that way, but I did end up expanding my scope and I saw this thing called a business development representative and I had no idea what it was. And I just applied. I read through the description, seemed simple enough. And so I applied and luckily a gentleman named Tom Johannix, who was a great mentor for my brief stint at Bill.com, called me back and went in for interviews, ended up working at Bill.com as a business development representative for a little bit. And that was all cold calling accounting offices to sell them business to business payment software.
Yeah. How did that feel at the time making that pivot? Obviously, you're like, I need a job. Let me be less specific about where I want to be. You land this role. What are you thinking when you get into this job? When you start
Yeah.
making all of these cold calls?
Let me say there's two parts to it. One positive, one ego. Ego piece of me was like, I would really like to be doing finance instead. Like, I don't know that I want to be cold calling people, but the other side, which is the pros, like I was getting paid well and I had health insurance for the first time in a long time. And I had a 401k set up. I felt like an adult. I felt like I was, hey, welcome. It was felt validating in some ways. And then some of my ego was also keeping me from really appreciating it for what it was. And so there's a little balance there for sure. But I did well, which was really cool. And that also felt great. So, a couple months in, when it was clear that I was performing pretty well and it seemed like there would be some mobility there, or I had some options, that kind of thing. Then I was more willing to let the finance stuff go.
It totally makes sense. You come in and you start crushing it at a skill that you did not really know that you had. Is that fair to say? Or
I had done like little odd jobs here and there. I actually sold Kirby vacuums for a period of time, door to door. And
okay.
I had done some canvassing for Greenpeace too. So the whole talking to strangers thing was not new.
Yeah.
I've been pretty good at that for a little bit. I was definitely grateful. That wasn't like a huge shift or didn't make me feel super uncomfortable or anything like that. Cold calling came pretty naturally. And
explain the distinction between like BDR and like what comes next in maybe that kind of like vertical of function. So
yeah,
you are gathering leads and warming them up and handing them off.
There is a bit of there's progression, a typical progression. Normally you start in as an SDR and then you get promoted to something like an account executive, which is a closing role.
Okay.
So then typically an SDR will hand over, hey, I cold called or cold emailed or whatever into this prospect. They agree to have a meeting. Now you take over and you run that sales cycle until there's an order form that's signed. I think SDRs are responsible for a little bit more these days, definitely. But back then, it was cold call, get a time on the calendar, right? Make sure that time's confirmed. Give the AE, or the account executive, any texture that you were able to get from that call. So you were encouraged to do a little bit of what we call discovery, right? So asking thoughtful, well-informed questions and trying to pull a little bit of information out so the AE is just not going in absolutely blind. And so anyway, that role went well. But I was also commuting from Santa Cruz to Palo Alto, which rough. I was waking up at 4:30 trying to beat the traffic in the South Bay, and it's just a drag.
That sounds awful.
In the background, there's this other company that was starting to grow quite a bit in Santa Cruz, and so I turned my attention that way.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us a little bit about how that happens. You're in this BDR, SDR role at Bill.com. The commute is not great. And then this opportunity pops up. How did you find this role? And then what were the other kind of pull factors or push factors of why did you transition to this new company? Having it in your hometown or having it in your, like closer to where you live, obviously is one, but from like an industry perspective, role perspective, did you have a sense of what were the kind of like trade-offs that you were weighing?
Yeah, two pieces to it, like you said. There was the first one, which is the commute. So just like a very...
it's a quality of life decision.
I mean, exactly. I mean, that was a pretty good push, I would say, versus pull. But on the pull, right, Bill.com is a great company. They're a fantastic product. They've done really well for themselves. But at the time, it was like data's the new oil, and Looker, this company that was founded in Santa Cruz and headquartered there, was a business intelligence platform, still is. And I had gotten to know a handful of folks at Looker. Best friend of mine was working there, and my sister was working there. So I'd gone to a few of their happy hours. I met a ton of folks there. They were all surfers like me, and they loved mountain biking like me. And there was just like a lot of cultural fit. And they were also just really thoughtful people. And I really, really enjoyed kind of being in the room with them. And I think one of the things that, since I had started going to school, and this is a piece of advice that I think a lot of people get, I first heard it from that professor that I love so much, Dr. Pham, to just never be the smartest person in the room. And I'm not saying that I was the smartest person in the room at Bill.com, but I could sense that the folks at Looker were operating at a different level. The product managers that were there were super sharp, just deadly. The sales leadership was really good. Just across the board, it was just incredible. And I tried to get myself in there as quickly as I could. And I got an offer and told the VP at Bill.com, I say, hey, look, this commute's killing me. I think Looker is going to do great things. I think you're going to do great things too, but I think I'm going to go ahead and jump ship. And Andy Cohen, VP at the time for Bill.com, was awesome. He said, hey, look, we'd love to keep you. Is there anything we can do? I said, look, aside from letting me work remote and promoting me to account executive today, it's going to be tough for me to be able to do that. And he said, yeah, I get it. I totally understand. Went to Looker and started my SDR role at Looker, which was fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah. Tell us about that. I really appreciate the depth that you went into when you made this transition. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. It was an SDR role. It was similar. I was what was called an inbound sales development representative. And I would say that I had been doing cold calling off of a list of folks who had expressed zero interest in Bill.com. At Looker, I was calling a list of folks that had some kind of interaction with Looker. Maybe they submitted a demo request form through the website. Maybe they attended a webinar. There was some kind of existing familiarity with Looker, right? So my job was to call into those folks and effectively do the same thing. Get as much information I can on a relatively brief call and then book that meeting for an account executive. And so I did that for, I want to say 3 or 4 months. And then they had an opening for an account executive on the SMB team, stands for small and medium-sized businesses. And I applied and got it, which was phenomenal. I couldn't have asked for a better kind of progression in my time there. And I was super, super grateful for that.
Can I ask, when you're in like these SDR roles, what is the reporting structure like? Like you're obviously like serving these leads into account executives. Are you reporting to them as well? Or does SDR exist as like a separate function that is like a service angle to the account executives?
It's more the latter.
Okay.
So at least in my experience, I'm sure there are organizations that have them bundled that way, but generally speaking, SDRs are not reporting out to account executives. Account executives are almost always individual contributors. A vast majority of account executives do not manage. They don't do any people management.
I'm curious, you had even told your former boss, like if you could promote me to an account executive today, that would be, maybe that's the only way that I could stay. At what point did you know that was the role that you wanted to be in next, especially when it's not necessarily like in the same kind of like function vertical? Did you ever consider, because you were really killing it as an SDR, BDR in your last role, hey, I could be managing people as a people manager in this function? Was that ever something that came up to you?
It did. It was. And actually, I'm so funny you bring that up. So when I was doing that, I started doing team lead responsibilities, which is great, which means I was not people managing. I wasn't doing any of the HR pieces, but some functional stuff like day to day, I was helping out with. Making sure that everybody's software was working correctly. We're on a number of different platforms that had to all talk to each other in the right way in order for you to do your job efficiently. And so I was helping out with that stuff and doing like a little bit of coaching for new hires. And so, yeah, I actually had wanted to manage an SDR team. That was my real goal.
Cool.
But then one day when those AE slots, account executive spots opened up, I got called into the office with my frontline manager, a guy named Brady Park. Hey, Brady, I hope you're out there. And then another guy named Kyle Coleman, who has gone on to do amazing things. Shout out to you, Kyle. Your experience mentorship was invaluable. And they called me in and they said, hey, look, we have these AE roles opening up. Are you interested in applying? And I was like, I don't know. I was really thinking I wanted to manage a BDR team. And either because they thought account executive would be a better career choice for me, or because they didn't see me as a good fit as a manager. I don't know. Maybe a bit of both. Who knows? They're like, no, you should do the account executive thing.
I'm very curious about this point because there's a potential fork in the road here. There is an opportunity that exists, right? That is actually for your career advancement, better pay, more prestige, but it's not necessarily in the realm that you wanted. And you have a couple of folks that kind of brought you into a conversation that like as mentors, and your verification of whether this was the right move for you was to basically ask, are you sure? And they said yes. And you were like, tell me about, was it just a gut feeling? They're like, I trust these guys. Let's just do it. And
I think also things were just moving so fast at the company, and it was kind of take an opportunity where you can grab it. You know, if you could pull yourself up a rung, then do it. And I did. Any SDR who's tried to go for an account executive position will be familiar with this process. I practiced my demo as best as I could. I practiced my discovery as best as I could for a couple of weeks since I just sat down and did my best and then ended up getting it. So anyway, became an account executive at Looker, and it's where the lion's share of my professional career started.
That's great. And so tell us about that. You get into this account executive role. This is your career for the next however many years at a bunch of different companies. Let's talk about it. What was being at Looker as an account executive like? And then how did it change over time?
I loved being an account executive at Looker. Yeah. The people were amazing. The product was fantastic. The company was awesome. The typical kind of account executive progression is some version of SMB to mid-market to commercial to enterprise, or basically just going up in company size. So
that's your progression as an account, as like an IC, an account exec. Okay, gotcha.
Exactly. And you have a number of choices as an account executive. You can hang out in SMB and then try to become an SMB manager. And the same is true for every one of those kind of buckets, those tiers, right?
I see.
But more commonly, most people will start an SMB, then go to the larger segments. And so I was lucky enough to go through a couple of those segments at Looker. We were acquired by Google, kind of 2020, 2021. And that changed the company a little bit, right? We are now part of a much larger organization. The writing was on the wall. Processes were going to change. Team structures were going to change. The way that, we interacted with the rest of the company was going to change. I used to have access to, product people pretty regularly. Now there was a process in place then that obfuscated your access to product managers or folks that could walk through product roadmap with prospects, and access just got a little more limited. Right? And that's just a product of the part of a company that's really big, and that's okay. It just wasn't what I was looking for at the time.
At what point did you start looking for your next thing, or kind of deciding that you were going to move on? Because acquisitions take time. There's all these sorts of processes and stuff, introducing a lot of bureaucracy. At what point in time were you like, okay, this is my time here is wrapping up?
Yeah. During the acquisition, the regulatory processes took a long time. So there was a long freeze on career progression for, I want to say, a year.
Okay.
And by the time that was kind of moratorium was lifted, right? Because they don't want to move people around in the middle of a transaction, right? And they're not trying to change payroll a whole lot. They've got to try to keep things almost frozen in time from the day that the agreement was signed. And that meant we were frozen in our career progressions as well. And that's not to say that we weren't looking forward to being a part of Google, as we certainly were. Like I said, the same thing with the private equity piece. If you had told 2010 Marshall that, you're going to have a Google badge, I would have told you you're nuts. There was no way. And so that felt like there was a huge sense of accomplishment there too. I was like, oh my God, you and I grew up in the Valley. Like you and I knew what that word meant.
Totally.
So it fluffed the ego. It did all these things, but the career progression piece really slowed down.
That makes a lot of sense. You get this thing, it's Google, you get the Google badge. It's awesome. You've had this accomplishment in your career, but career advancement gets a lot harder. And the actual facts on the ground make it so that you can't do the things that you enjoyed about the role to begin with, in terms of being closely tied to the product and other stakeholders.
And COVID hit. So we were all working remote. So one of the things that I loved about working at Looker was being in the office with all those good people and being swallowed by a large organization, not being in the office with all those folks that I really enjoyed working with. Really just all those things compounded. And so I ended up pursuing another role it took about a year and a half or 2 years. I forget what the exact timeline was, but I think it was almost a couple of years I spent at Google. And then I got an opportunity to be an enterprise account executive somewhere else. And that's pretty typical. You'll see that a lot if you're a mid-market or SMB even account executive at the large organization like Google. You can pick up enterprise account executive jobs. And enterprise is like the biggest companies you can sell to. That's the idea there. You can pick up enterprise account executive roles at smaller companies. And so that's what I did.
Yeah. Tell us about the company that you went to. What attracted you to that opportunity?
Yeah. It was a company called Assemble, and they do workforce management software for basically customer service organizations, co-founded by a couple of brothers that came from Stripe. And they built a very clever platform that does really good things for folks that are looking to staff customer success or customer service organizations. It's very tricky to kind of staff customer service and customer success organizations properly to meet inbound kind of volume. So I got hired by a guy named Justin Schaefer, great guy. And he and I were on the same page in terms of kind of the way that we saw the selling motion and kind of the way that we saw the process and all that good stuff. And eventually, and I don't want to speak for Justin or the board or the co-founders, but there were some disagreements and Justin ended up parting ways with Assembled. And then I was close to follow. I think it's 6 to 8 weeks later, I was also asked to leave, which was the first time I'd ever been let go from an organization. And that was pretty painful because I had been doing well. I had hit and all that good stuff. And it was a tough hit to take, but
I'm really sorry to hear that. It's a rough place to be.
Okay.
When you joined this place, when I asked you what attracted you to it, there's obviously like the hiring manager and you really got along, saw things in a very similar way. You've talked about going to Looker. A big part of it was like the people and being like, oh, these people are smart. I like really vibe with them. And I feel like they're very like honest, sincere people. So there's a little bit of that. The other thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was like, you just went into a description of the company and the product. And like one of the things that you had mentioned about Looker was how much you appreciated the product and like what it actually like accomplished. And when you're in a position, like an account executive position, does the belief in the product and liking the product really help you do your job?
Well, yeah. Yeah, it makes a huge difference. No doubt about it. It's very difficult to sell something that you don't believe in. You gotta have ice in your veins to do that. And I can't say that I'm built for that. I've always wanted to try to be a part of an organization whose product is bleeding edge, right? So where the market is will be tomorrow and will hopefully be a year or two from now. Because if you fall any further behind than that, you're in deep shit.
Yeah.
It's not easy. It's not fun. You're trying to get product requests through engineering and all that good stuff, which you're doing anyway, all the time with any organization, no matter how amazing the product is. But it just gets so bad when the thing you're selling is falling behind the marketplace more broadly. It's terrible.
So you joined this thing, you had your push factors off of Google, your pull as people and product is very similar to coming to Looker, I think.
The other piece, you talked about the pull piece, and I mentioned this a minute ago. It was a title chase too. I was moving from a mid-market role at Looker and Google and was looking to have enterprise. That was part of it too.
Yeah.
And so I ended up pivoting over to another analytics company called Mixpanel. And Mixpanel is product analytics, basically user behavior, things like that. You may be familiar.
Definitely. I've used Mixpanel. It's so funny because I've used both Looker and Mixpanel in the past. Yeah, it's like product manager, like you're selling to PMs.
Yeah.
But tell us about how you found Mixpanel. Did you have other offers on the table at the time?
I think when you get let go, you hit the panic button, and I started blasting resumes out and trying to talk to as many people as I possibly could. And so I ended up reaching out to somebody I used to work with at Looker who had ended up taking a sales manager position at Mixpanel.
Cool.
And so we got to chatting and we ended up agreeing that it would be a good fit and went through their process and ended up as an enterprise rep for Mixpanel, which was great. We had a tough year that year, so it was pretty rough. And I was starting to feel pretty burned out. I think after the Assembled thing with it, I might have been a little long for that world. I was starting to get pretty tired and I was burned out, really. And at some point in my journey at Mixpanel, I knew that it would probably be a good idea for me to step away and take some time. So that's what I did. At a certain point, I think I was there for about a year and then decided to step away. And I ended up taking nearly a year off.
If you were to look back on your burnout, what were the things that kind of led to it? And then, because I've been in this boat, and I think a lot of people have, and I think this is something that is really important to identify causes for and not just symptoms of.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about what reflection you might have done as to when you get to that point, what you might be doing differently.
Yeah. I think it's like a number of different things. So it's hard to pin down as you would expect. It's obviously not just one thing.
Yeah.
I think that if I'm being really candid, there are a few things that really stick out to me. One, when you work for companies that have taken venture capital and the market's taken a downturn, which it had at that point, things get tense, really tense. And I think that there are organizations, and a couple of them that I work for are guilty of this. There are stages in Salesforce, right? So you have an opportunity, it's in Salesforce, and it's maybe the first, however the company decides to name their kind of deal stages, right? There's discovery and
Funnel.
then demo and then whatever. There's usually, between 5 and 7 of these stages. And there seemed to be this kind of growing trend in sales management. And I've talked to other folks in our other companies who have seen this too, where if you take an initial call, it's discovery and it moves into, say, demo, which means you just ask them a bunch of questions about their company and what they're trying to accomplish by working with somebody like you. And you're saying, okay, this is like a good enough fit to show them the product. That's it. That's like the only commitment that they've made. It got to the point, and I think there's just a lot of downward pressure from VCs to board to C-suite to just all the way down the chain. And it eventually gets to a point where if you move something from discovery into demo, the expectation is there's no reason you shouldn't close that.
Huh.
And it's just not true. One, it's an unreasonable expectation. And look, in their defense, they'll turn around and say, oh no, we actually bake in a 25 to 35% close rate. But the pressure for each individual deal, it becomes a lot. Especially
they expect you to close earlier in that funnel. That pressure is coming when things are not it's just like things are not going as well. The economy's going down, funding is drying up like broadly in the economy.
Or you're in a crowded space and getting outpaced by somebody else, or maybe their value got marked down. There's like a number of things that can happen. I'm not saying any of those did, but I think that there's just the downward pressure when things are not going as well as some executives would like to see, just especially on the enterprise side, right? Because enterprise is presumably pulling in large logos. Like I worked with Honda and a number of other folks, these very large organizations. And part of the enterprise motion is you kind of have to map out an entire company and try to figure out how to sell into each one of those.
Yeah. What I'm hearing from you is maybe some symptoms of some of the downward pressure that ends up being applied onto the company and the sales organization. What was happening on the ground? Does this start happening at Assembled? Did that carry over into Mixpanel? Because you talk about burnout, right? And it sounds like you're describing one of the symptoms. Were the facts on the ground in terms of what your close rates were actually changing at all? Was that actually getting worse for the sales organization?
Yeah, it was. I wasn't hitting my number. I wasn't hitting 100% quota for that year. It wasn't atrocious.
Yeah.
But it was one of those things where I was kind of like, it's just an icky feeling. You want to be at 100% of quota. Your comp is 50-50 base and variable, right? At most of these account executive roles. Yeah, it sucks. It just doesn't feel good. You have to go every quarter, you do a QBR, quarterly business review, and you sit down and you say, hey, these are the deals that didn't work out. Right. And the idea most of the time is to do constructive postmortem, right? Hey, why didn't this close? What can we do the next time? And I was just tired, Varun. I was really tired. I bounced between Google, Assembled, and Mixpanel all within a couple of years. And it takes a while to get your footing as a salesperson in any new organization, right? There's a learning curve on the product. There's building your book. There's all the mapping out the organization for yourself, just internally. Hey, who can I go to reliably to get answers through these sales processes? And I was just tired of it.
Couple of things that I'm hearing, which is there's a lot of different factors. The actual, there's a big one, which is essentially is like the environment became hard to sell. And so there's a lot of pressure, like externally, internally, and then you're forced to make a lot of shifts.
And I was just tired. I think my push out was personal. I was just exhausted. And I think it was time for me to figure out how to get my blood pressure down. And
the reason that I ask all of these questions is really we're tracking those like push-pull factors, and like we're seeing the kind of trends in your pulls of being like opportunity for advancement, people, and product. And it's like it does seem like there was some elements of all three when you went to Mixpanel, but you were already in your like beginning phases of burnout. and those things are not necessarily enough, what happens on the other side of that? What was the point where you were like, I need to leave this job with nothing lined up? Speaking to you as somebody that has just very recently
It's
left a
scary,
job
yeah,
with
it's a
nothing lined
scary
up.
thing to do, but
Yeah.
well, I gotta tell you, I was in a position, fortunately, where I could take some substantial time off without being on the street, which I know is not a luxury or a privilege that everybody can afford to take. And I fully appreciate that and figured, hey, you know what? Let's take some serious time and kind of regroup, circle the wagons.
Maybe just rewind back to a little bit. When you started your first job in construction, and there was a friend of yours that kind of pulled you into it, and there's this sense of needing to perform in order to make sure that you're maintaining that relationship and like reciprocating in good faith by performing really well.
Yeah.
There was somebody that brought you into this job that you used to work with before. Did you feel any of that pressure?
Of course.
Guilt? Yeah.
No, he knew me as somebody who performed and executed when we were at Looker together, right? And not hitting 100% when I was at Mixpanel there's a bit of shame that came along with that, of guilt.
Yeah, that's hard. So, burnout, tough environment, and you leave.
Yes.
Tell me about the time that you had off.
Oh my God, it was amazing.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, like I said, I surf and stuff like that. So spent some time really centering around that and played a lot of golf. And went on vacation, did a few camping trips, took care of stuff around the house I've been putting off, just living life. And it didn't get to the point where I didn't know what day of the week it was, but it crept. It was starting to bleed into that. So that's when I was kind of like, I should both around a little bit. And funny enough, the time I breathed deeper, blood pressure went down, both literally and metaphorically.
Yeah.
And through the connection of my girlfriends, I ended up having lunch with somebody who is the president of a private lender, Herzer Financial. And we sat down and we talked about they were recently acquired by another company, and he had taken over to run Herzer Financial on behalf of Socotra Capital. And sat down and started talking about kind of the things that, some of my experience, things that I'm familiar with, the way that I approach the go-to-market motion. Right. And so it started off as, hey, maybe you run our ADU loan program. And I said, that sounds really interesting. We kept talking for a couple of months and then eventually sharpened our pencils and got something on paper that works for the both of us. And I've been there ever since.
And then when you ended up meeting this person for lunch or whatever, was it, hey, I'm looking for somebody to do this, or did this kind of come over organically?
This came up more organically. The person who had recommended that we chat he's the CFO of the acquiring company.
Gotcha.
He was a very impressive person. I got a really good read from him, and he was really transparent about what he was trying to accomplish. And we just kept the conversation going, right? Was there a world where I fit into this picture? And do you think that's a good idea? Is this kind of in line with your expectations in terms of my experience and lack of experience? Also, I had not been in the debt space ever. Not something that I had spent any time doing, but I had spent a lot of time learning how to move a deal from start to close and figure out sales process and documentation, all the little pieces that when people think of sales, they think of somebody who's good at shaking hands and hosting dinners, but in reality, it's mostly process, right?
Yeah.
It's mostly just documenting as much as you can, bringing substantive information that's valuable or of value to whoever the prospect is, right? That kind of thing. And so I think that he has a vision for the organization that is a little more centered around that version of selling versus maybe what has been historically seen as a outdated but less digitally native selling motion for loan officers specifically.
I see. Tell me a little bit more about what you're doing right now and what it's like, and this is really interesting. Yeah. And what were the real pull factors here? It sounds like there's a people aspect to it. And like, what were the other things that you were excited about when you were joining? And not just joining, it sounds like really co-crafting a role for yourself at this company.
Yeah. So my official title is product manager, actually, funny enough.
Yeah.
I function more as a loan officer though, when it comes to, if you were to try to get your feelers out across the industry and say, hey, what does Marshall do? Most people would say loan officer.
Okay.
They call me a product manager because I own the ADU loan program specifically, which was in its infancy at the time when I started. My boss, the person I was so impressed with, Roy, had started the program, but he needed somebody to really pick it up and do the business development piece. And we're seeing great success. We're seeing a lot of traction, which is awesome. And then I also pivoted into just construction writ large. So I also handle ground up construction projects for mostly speculative projects. So what we call spec. So for sale or for rent, right? Well, or even more broadly, business purpose. And so I spent a lot of time building relationships with contractors, brokers, all these other folks. And not very dissimilar from what kind of a traditional loan officer would do.
Gotcha.
I'm just spending maybe more time on the company's overall go-to-market presence. So that includes digital marketing, that includes events, that includes a few other pieces that I think are typically a little outside of normal loan officers' purview.
Tell me if I have this right. You're seeing the deals for lending for specific projects, starting with ADUs, but also you've expanded your scope to other construction projects. It sounds like both commercial and residential.
Yeah. If it involves construction, give me a call. And it's also worth mentioning that we are a private lender and we have 70 plus years worth of construction experience, which has been tremendously helpful for me in ramping up in this organization, right? Because there's just so it's not a company full of brand new people. It's a company that has a handful of really experienced, really talented folks that I can lean on, which is great.
Tell me a little bit about what this means for you and your career going forward,
Yeah.
or how you see it. This sounds really interesting because like you're doing a whole bunch of different stuff. It doesn't sound like there's a ladder for what is your product manager / loan officer.
Really.
Yeah,
I think that the best thing that I could hope for is to grow my book of business to the point where I can't handle all of it. Right. And I think that is right now my North Star. So how do I grow my book of business to the point where I just don't have enough time and we could justify bringing on headcount?
Sure.
But in terms of the kind of the frame of mind that you just mentioned, right? Like, where do you go from here? That would probably be where I would want to go. It's also worth mentioning that Herzer Financial and Secotra Capital, we are what's called a portfolio lender. So we are an alternative asset class for investors. So accredited investors can put cash into our fund. We turn around, take that cash and lend it out on high quality construction projects. In our case, in our instance, we have investors who are looking to get yield and we have borrowers who are looking to build, right?
Yep.
I hope to get to the point where the book of business is going really well. And then I get to help support increasing the size of the fund. So doing some more of the investor relations pieces, perhaps, or trying to figure out how to license ourselves so that we can expand our offerings. The goal is growth. And how do I support growth in a way that makes sense? Right now, I'm just hyper focused on sourcing loan opportunities. I'm really happy with the direction we're going in, which is awesome. I also don't feel the kind of the early signs of burnout or anything. And so that feels really nice. But yeah, right now I'm laser focused on just growing the business and then hopefully we can start thinking a little bit bigger.
Where you are now is meaningfully different than where you were before.
Yeah.
You had these kind of like external markers, I think, that made it maybe easy to index on something that you're working towards, right? So like how you're contributing to growth at a company as a BDR or an account executive, right, is like growing business for the company and then being rewarded with some kind of like promotion or new job or new title, etc. That process doesn't really exist here. And I'm curious, did you think about that as a trade-off when coming into this company? Because part of the way that I'm thinking about it is that like you can contribute to the growth of this company in a way that's really freeing, right? You don't really have these markers and you can worry about that later and just focus on the work. But
I could not have said it better myself. And even who doesn't love a bookend? Right.
Yeah.
And I think going all the way back, and if we're thinking about kind of the emotional push-pull of where you are in your career and the reason you make certain decisions about the work that you choose to do. In the beginning, it was just find anything, find identity, find purpose. Then it became, oh, wow, I have some expectations of myself that I didn't expect myself to have, but I'd like to execute on those. And then it becomes, okay, now I have health insurance. That's pretty awesome. I'm a 401k. How much career progression can I find in this space? And I think it was so hyper focused on that. Like how can I continue to increase my visibility in a company that's of size and that's growing? That comes with its own pressures. You're asking for those pressures when you walk into those roles, and you want that visibility and you want that responsibility. And now, to answer your question, I think I'm coming at it from a perspective that's a little more focused on balance. I am focusing a little bit more on making sure that whatever I'm doing is sustainable for me personally. Now, I have more ambitions than that. I think I'd like to help grow the business and, make sure that we're doing it sustainably from both a financial and emotional perspective.
Cool. Hey, thanks, Marshall. This was an incredible conversation. Thanks so much for taking the time. It's been so good to reconnect and just learn about what you've been up to.
It's been an absolute treat, Varun. I appreciate you. If you need anything, always feel free to reach out. I'm always just a phone call away, right?
Yeah, I'll probably do it. We'll probably hang if I swing back by the bay. Such an amazing conversation. We really summed it up at the end there about how his transitions were informed by the things that really motivated him over time. When he got into the SDR, BDR, and account executive roles, how really wanting to perform and be successful and see how far he could go in that career was something that kept driving him until it didn't. One thing that really impressed me about Marshall was his history of trusting his gut, taking the opportunity when you can grab it. Like that one time he was moving from a BDR role into an account executive at Looker. He wasn't really overanalyzing going in that direction versus being a manager of BDRs. He had some input from people that he trusted, and he said, okay, let's just keep going. I have a short window here. There's an opportunity. I'm going to grab it. And even from the time that he had burnout and resigning, getting a sense of needing to get back to work, the days weren't quite blending together, but he had a gut sense that it was important for him to start figuring out what was next for him. I think we might all be better served if we trust ourselves a little bit more to know when something is right or something's wrong. There is that internal sense of wanting to do the right thing and understanding where you need to pivot your attention. But early on, we also talked about social pressure being something that was a positive motivator for Marshall. It's really in vogue to talk about how we should avoid all social pressure and not worry about what other people are doing. But when he saw his peers graduating from school and going into the workforce, that was something that actually motivated him in a way that he looks back on as a positive step. It just goes to show nothing is really cut and dry. You need some balance between positive social pressures pointing you into a direction that you might actually want to go, as well as those moments where you need to actually take a break. Huge thanks to Marshall for being on the podcast. And if you like this, share this episode with anybody and everybody that you can. Leave a review on any of the podcast apps that you're listening to this on. And if you know anybody that has a really cool career story, send them my way. I would love to interview them. Every single one of these stories bestows a bunch of wisdom upon me and hopefully gives you something to learn and chew on as well. So thanks so much again for listening, watching, and I'll see you at the next one.